Hey everyone, tonight we'll start with the extraordinary lives and astounding fortitude of medieval peasants. Common people who, in defiance of the odds, survived some of the coldest and bloodiest nights in history. From their tale is one of communal sleeping techniques and homemade insulating tactics, of perseverance, resourcefulness, and resolve. So before you settle in, please take a moment to subscribe and like the video, but only if you truly like what I tell me, where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you in the comments section. It's amazing to see who is coming from all around the world. Now turn off the lights and perhaps turn on an admirer of that gentle background hum, and let's take it slow tonight as we explore medieval life. For the typical peasant, winter was less about lavish feasts and joyous festivals than you might think for jousting knights. It wasn't just a season, it was a celebration of life and more about how we might avoid dying tonight. An annual endurance test that was particularly harsh and didn't believe in second chances. Imagine for a moment that you live in a small stick-and-mud home with walls so narrow with no insulation, you might likely hear a bird sneeze from outside. Windows, unless you include a tiny opening filled with animal hide, and most surely, your home's interior temperature was typically only a courteous couple of degrees, so there were no thermostat conflicts with your siblings. Regardless of what the weather was doing outside, it was courteously a little less freezing if it was freezing. The toughest nights were inside, when the blackness engulfed everything and the wind howled like a vengeful ghost, while the hearth fire pitifully flickered, trying its hardest, but mostly merely frying the toes of the person seated closest to you. If you were across the room, you might as well have been. It didn't help much either to camp outside with worse food and clothes. Peasants wore a few rough-spun wool tunics and sometimes a cloak instead of expensive fur coats or goose-down blankets. It had a weird goat scent, and you hoped that putting them on top would make you resemble a human onion. Didn't work at all, and forget about cuddling up in cozy comforters. Frequently just sacks filled with straw or hay, sometimes with a few old rushes added for good measure, and the term medieval peasant life refers to the extra luxury that some fleas provide for the company. In addition to being uncomfortable, the cold posed a risk of frostbite, hypothermia, and there was always a chance of general freezing to death, particularly for young children, and the being alive when you woke up each morning as an elderly person was regarded as a small marvel that was very worth surviving a medieval winter, perhaps with a somewhat less frozen turnip for breakfast. Wasn't about comfort, but rather about clenching your teeth and applying pressure to every huddled with your livestock, a piece of cloth you had, hoping you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the true journey was only getting started if you believe because the window doesn't close all the way. The apartment is drafty. Medieval peasants would like to say that their homes weren't. The majority of peasant cottages were what historians described as simply drafty. They were essentially very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Call WLE and Dorb construction with courtesy. Translation: sticks crosswise like a huge basket covered with a lovely concoction of dirt straw, and animal feces was a cheap, sticky substance. And no, they weren't attempting to be disgusting. Insulator, and it was always accessible, so let's pretend that these barriers don't. The chilly wind found every crevice, so no matter how carefully smeared, it had little hope against a real winter storm. Every opening, and joyfully swooped into the one-room houses, circling and ensuring you never got to cozy seclusion that isn't really warm or character-building. Indeed. And then there were the thatched roofs, which were quite charming. However, over several months of rain and snow, they began to sag, leak, and occasionally allow the local fauna to enter. Nice evening, like if a squirrel had fallen on your dining windows, which, if they existed at all, were ridiculously little. Although typically covered with wooden shutters or thin animal hides, the glass was so costly that even the lord of the manor most likely couldn't afford more than one little inconvenience, and peasants were only pleased if the cowhide wasn't torn from the wall in the middle of a blizzard to exacerbate the situation on the flooring. Were frequently simply compacted soil, and when it rained or snowed a lot, mud would seep up into the earth. Thus, in a sense, they had indoor water features, though they didn't particularly value them during the winter. It could feel like you're walking across a frozen swamp every time you enter your own house. It was three-dimensional, chilly from below, cold from above, and cold from within. Heat attack, but medieval peasants weren't the kind to complain. Human insulation was cuddled close to one another, moss-packed holes and old rags pushed into the worst drafts. Greatest ingenuity, obstinacy, and a little sheep grease applied to the walls were frequently the only thing preventing them from becoming into medieval popsicles, because if your home was collapsing, mud, dirt, and goat hair provided the best defense against the weather. At least if your teeth weren't chattering, you could sort of chuckle about it. As if the bitter cold wasn't difficult enough, medieval peasants also had to contend with a silent foe that rose from below. Back then, the frozen grounds floors weren't actually floors. Rather, they were only marginally flatter. Areas of dirt within your house. Perhaps, if you were fortunate, someone had tossed some old rushes or straw to give off the appearance of being comfortable. But in reality, you were sleeping when someone criticized you. The chill was unrelenting and seeped up as you backed away from the hard, icy soil, emerging from the ground like a malevolent, tiny ghost that worms its way through the straw, into your bones, and directly into your, "Hey, congrats." If you dropped something on the ground during a wintry night, it became a part of the permafrost medieval peasants attempted to combat this bleak conflict in a number of methods, including, if you could afford it, the technique involved spreading thick mats of straw across the floor. Or, more practically, you could have a chance if you could take enough of it from your neighbor's field without being discovered. Good insulating barrier. However, the straw quickly became flattened and moldy. Some households stacked dried rushes, adding a crunchy soundtrack to your already dreary nights. Instead, they would occasionally toss new rushes on top of the dirt without clearing away the previous ones. This eventually produced an intriguing ecosystem of fleas and decaying plants, and whatever enigmatic animals chose to settle there, it was essentially medieval. If your carpet smelled like a wet dog and was a little damp, consider installing carpet padding. For those who owned them, beds typically accomplished nothing more than, instead of being warm, wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Your mattress's shifting gritty layers did little to stop the cold from emanating from below, and turning was a desperate, awkward ballet to keep the blood flowing and prevent one side of the body from freezing, not for comfort. The truth is that medieval peasants did not so much conquer the frozen terrain as a good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. Rather, it was about waking up with the ability to live contentedly above it. You were doing well if you could take that off with all of your toes still attached. Superior to most if medieval houses had a winter hero. It wasn't the walls, the roof, or even the courageous stubborn fire was burning in the fireplace, insulated by layers of dirt and manure. Pit that provided the only practical protection from the medieval cold, darkness, and general gloom. A basic fire was the focal point of almost every peasant dwelling. Fireplace with an ornate stone mantel, But instead of a tidy chimney that blew smoke into the air, you had a simple pit or rock pile, partially burned wood, and enough smoke filling the space to make you question whether you were slowly turning into a ham. Yes, the majority of homes didn't even have smoke from chimneys, simply did its best to float out via tiny gaps in. It wasn't ideal for the roof to crack in the walls or to go straight into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that night, breathing, or your life expectancy. But on the plus side, it performed a fantastic job of, when fumigating fleas and other undesirable visitors who require pest control, you're marinating in smoke 24/7. The kitchen's light was just as important as the hearth's warmth. People would sit around the fire and tell stories, and occasionally they would even use the medieval equivalent of a television. Since there wasn't much else to do after nightfall to keep the fire going, people would either gossip or just stare into the flames. Alive wasn't merely a good idea. It was necessary to allow the fire to extinguish. At night was like sending a signal for the cold to come in and kill you. And it wasn't as easy to start a fire in the winter. It was as simple as striking a match. But you needed more prayers than you'd imagine. Flint steel kindling, and already provided, each member of the household had a responsibility to feed the fire while keeping an eye on the embers. It was a great way to add peat sticks, or, if you were lucky, a valuable piece of dried wood. Ongoing conflict between human tenacity and the oppressive cold that only wants to drown you. Although survival without the hearth was not guaranteed, it was definitely impossible. It was a small, smoky fire that frequently disappointed, but if there was one thing about medieval winter, it was the pulsating core of optimism. Peasants were more afraid of letting the fire go out overnight without that comforting flickering than they were of running out of ale. Thus, the cold would infiltrate more quickly than a tax collector following harvest. Additionally, building a fire from scratch in the midst of winter wasn't only inconvenient, it might be fatal. Lighters dream of rekindling a fire, although they didn't exist yet, meant hoping for a single precious spark by hitting flint and steel together, then tenderly caring for that spark. Imagine love and any dry kindling you haven't already burned in the previous days. Attempting to complete all of this while half asleep and with icy fingers in the dark. For further inspiration, include a wolf roaring in the distance, so the peasants became clever, and not in a comfortable savings account, but rather by carefully burying. Before going to bed, the embers were beneath a pile of ash, which served as a blanket. Protecting the blazing coals and ensuring their survival till the next day, if you could walk over before dawn, poke a little at the pile, add some fresh wood, and have a fire without the. However, if you did it poorly, let's just say that mornings got a lot of fire banking. A much grumpier and colder technique was inherited from like a treasured family recipe, parent to kid. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said to use only dry ash. Some said that a small amount of moisture was essential, while others packed the embers tightly. Allow them to breathe. By offering a superior fire banking technique, you could essentially spark a medieval dispute. It was the archaic equivalent of debating BBQ tactics, but with a little higher risk of surviving. A howling wind may occasionally burrow through a crevice and put out the fire, even if banking it wasn't enough. Or, some families took turns getting up in the morning since it was possible for clumsy sheep to fall into the hearth. In the end, fire banking is the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat at night to check the coals. Was more about purchasing a few more valuable hours of warmth than it was about conquering nature. And if you woke up to even one remaining ember, which was your triumph in that moment, and sufficient to withstand another day of fighting the cold in the Middle Ages. The saying, "the more the merrier," was a winter survival strategy that went beyond parties, when there was only one reliable source of warmth, each other, as the fire flickered and the frigid winds whistled through every crevice, and if it meant sharing a bed with your whole family, your neighbor's animals, and perhaps a very perplexed private space, wasn't even an idea on Goose, so forget about it. Comfort wasn't the aim on the coldest nights. Rather, it was to avoid waking up frozen. Whole households were heaped onto the floor and covered in the warmest corner of the house. They created what could be best characterized as a desperate snoring person out of whatever shreds of cloth they could find. Lasagna, with younger children crammed between parents and grandparents cuddling beneath the outer layers, and there was always space if Cousin Ethel appeared out of the blue. Additionally, if you were fortunate, you were able to sleep in the center, where body heat emanated from every direction. Unfortunately, you were perched on the brink, which is the medieval equivalent of sleeping close to a meat locker door. Someone who moved excessively during the night, shifting once to settle in, and then knocking on Aunt Maud's door. Congratulations, you're now a member of the family, as you enter the icy draft by the wall. There were occasions when the villain even shared bedding, a straw mattress that gradually deteriorated beneath the overnight weight of several generations, and the fact that, at the time, hygiene wasn't exactly garnering any accolades. To put it mildly, it wasn't the most odorous sleeping setup, but when you're up against frostbite, you stop. According to some medieval guides, being fussy about body heat wasn't simply pleasant, it was strategic. Also suggested placing the group's warmest and strongest members outside on purpose, acting as human shields. Frail, elderly people and infants were buried deep in the center, receiving treatment against the cold. Although it eventually became a part of their life, this wasn't only for survival, like the priceless tiny heat generators they were. Using daily living as a means of strengthening family ties, spending long winter evenings snuggled together led to singing, storytelling, and definitely some really fascinating discussions that were muffled by a communal wool blanket. So remember that at least you're not fighting the next time your dog hogs the bed or your sibling snatches your blanket. For elbow room between a very critical goat and a snoring uncle. If you felt that contemporary roommates were difficult, medieval peasants would like to show you their winter housemates: pigs, chickens, goats, cows, and pretty much everything with a heartbeat. And bringing animals within with a little body heat wasn't just a peculiar Hamlet custom. It was essential for, in a poorly insulated HVAC, where the wind howled louder than your stomach, survival livestock provided warmth. Every inch counted, and if your goat and you were on the same wall, it was two birds are somewhat less likely to be stolen in the middle of the night by a neighbor. The house turned into a chaotic living furnace of chickens at night because of one odorous stone. Cows lounged in luxury, while pigs snorted next to the fireplace, nestled in corners. It wasn't fancy at all, munching cud against the walls as if they were paying rent. Imagine being stranded in a car during a summer road trip with someone who neglected to take a shower. That's a cow, though, and it's winter, and there's nowhere else to go. The fragrance of a shared winter was something that was legendary by springtime. Intense, your nose were already on a crazy journey before you even lit a candle. Yet medieval villagers created They didn't moan much because they were aware of the unsettling fact that the more creatures inside, the fewer some animals even had good places, such as cows, despite having cold toes in the morning. Near the family goats, the largest and warmest goats typically took center stage. Let closer in for their warmth, and since goats would inevitably find a way inside, Hens roosted inside. Rafters or old baskets and pigs. Well, the pigs just plopped down, not caring. Anywhere they wanted, most likely in the center of the floor, of course. Sharing your bedroom with animals wasn't risk-free. Picture falling asleep quietly just to be abruptly. A bird stumbling barefoot into something, or determining your hair makes an excellent perch, can wake you up. The first thing in the morning could be suspicious. Certainly. Medieval mornings could be full of peasants grasped the basic math despite the cacophony, odors, and odd hoof to the ribs. In the fight against the frigid winter, cows cuddle whether they want to or not, and cold kills. In the Middle Ages, a warm, slightly slobbery cow's breath was frequently the difference between life and death. The goal of winter fashion was to keep peasants alive, not to look attractive. Weren't browsing the newest styles. Instead, they were dressing as though they were getting ready to fight, that the Grim Reaper himself had a simple rule. If you owned it, you wore it occasionally. First, the simple undertunic is made of scratchy, possibly unclean linen. Over that, place a heavier woolen tunic, and if you have it, add additional ragged cloak hung over your shoulders, trousers that sagged at the knees, and if you were extremely fortunate, a patched congratulations. A sheep's skin is put on top like a trophy. 90% itchier boots and 10% warmer boots were affluence. Many peasants placed their feet inside wooden clogs and covered them with layers of fabric or old rags. The cold continued to bite, so you simply put another rag, and I hoped you avoided losing your foot and forgetting to wash all these layers. It was necessary to pull your clothing to a frozen creek in the middle of winter and then smash through the ice. If your one and only shirt didn't freeze into a terrible shirt, you would have to wait 2 days for it to dry. Thus, the majority of peasants prudently concluded that smelling like a mixture of smoke, perspiration, and sheep were a minor cost of not freezing solid, and the grime and oil were particularly intriguing. An added benefit of accumulation was that the dirty layer that was trapped inside the body provided insulation, like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, but it was much less socially acceptable and smelled worse than the caps, scarves, and gloves of today. Were cherished items, a basic woolen cap may determine whether they survived the night or woke up. Gloves were frequently constructed from whatever was available, including hair frozen to the wall. People could scrangle leather or cloth shreds, sometimes appearing more depressed. Puppet costumes over anything trendy, and kids were particularly swaddled until they looked more like. The objective was to catch the filled turnips as they waddled clumsily around the house. Style, elegance, and as much precious body heat as possible. I've never heard of them. The true medieval flex was warmth. So the next time you gripe about wearing layers, remember this. On a cold day, keep in mind that medieval peasants would wander around in half of their clothes at once, looking like. In the dirt of the medieval peasant playbook, lumpy laundry sacks and feeling fortunate for it weren't merely. Something you cleaned off was essentially a survival tool because, as it turns out, becoming dirty wasn't an indication that it was tactical and smart, dare we say, to give up on life. Genius saw that winter presented a unique challenge. Heat loss from clean garments. Even though newly laundered linen was breathable, it was shockingly bad at keeping you warm. However, when the temperature of the air was somewhere between that of hypothermia and immediate regret, so it wasn't particularly appealing. Point where dirt entered the picture as peasants labored day after day. Layers of dirt, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud started to accumulate after a day without cleaning their clothes. Over time, this natural armor filled the tiny holes in their leggings, cloaks, and tunics. It was like the Middle Ages, with holes in the fabric making clothing more windproof. Simply put, weatherproofing made you smell more like a goat. You lost a wager, yet you were actually warm. Some medieval people felt that bathing yourself too frequently during the winter could really make you ill, so it's best to maintain that protective barrier intact. When it did exist, soap was rare, laundry was very rarer, and bathing with the filth barrier intact was saved for important events, such as when the bishop arrived or even just before you passed away, to add to the plan. Peasants layered their garments, simply tossing the fresh layer on top of the previous one without altering the ones underneath. You ultimately turned into a walking museum of all the stains from the previous 6 weeks, narrating the valiant tale of how I once slipped in the mud and survived. Medieval peasants may have appeared and smelled like they to outside onlookers, had entirely abandoned personal cleanliness, but the peasants were aware that the crusty tunic served as a heat barrier to prevent frostbite death. But it wasn't dazzling but not so cold that you didn't want to smell like flowers, except from in a world where you weren't hurting anyone's nose, but absolutely everyone stank to heaven. Yes, during the medieval winters, grime wasn't a problem because blindness was essentially a way of life. Failure. It was both functional and fashionable, and if you had a thick, oily exterior. By February, my buddy, you were succeeding in life if you believed in the Middle Ages. Peasants huddled together in embroidered quilts and luxurious feather mattresses throughout the winter, but the truth was a little different. More rustic. By rustic, I mean let's hope and sleep on a heap of dead plants. Because the greatest mattresses were typically rough in the medieval peasant life. If you could afford it, a timber frame covered with a large sack filled with old rushes or straw hay would be ideal. No orthopedic support, memory foam, or 5-star hotel encounter, just a slightly prickly, gritty, lumpy stuff that had a subtle scent of every twist and turn of the night provided a lovely symphony of barnyard and remorse. Some peasants are stalked by crinkling straw and the occasional harsh punch from a rogue. Even omitted the wooden frame completely, throwing the straw directly onto the dirt floor to create an opulent sleeping experience that contemporary influencers would most likely rename as the straw beds in earth-connected sleep were not only uncomfortable, but they were also only transitory. Over time, the straw changed the straw because it had become a biological danger area, flattened, got moldy, attracted pests, and usually often carried out a few times a year if you were conscientious, or whenever your bed began to move aggressively. Without your permission, rushes were a common substitute for these long grasses, which were occasionally thickly distributed on the ground, combined with herbs like lavender or rosemary to cover up the overpowering smell of new livestock in daily living. For roughly a day, rushes had a pleasant scent before becoming a part of the muck. Inside the house, the trodden landscape blends in perfectly with the dirt meals, crumbs, anything else that happened to walk in, and of course, the bedfellows' fleas. If you woke up scratching, it was because lice and other cute creatures enjoyed straw bedding nearly as much as the peasants did. More than you slept, congrats. You were experiencing the real medieval world. Despite the difficulties, these modest beds saved lives. Straw mounds clumped together on top of them and offered a vital insulating barrier against the freezing ground. Medieval central heating at its best, creating zones of shared body heat so that the next time you gentle, supportive mattress, just think of a medieval peasant somewhere, is observing you from the past, smiling through a gaping mouth and stating, "Must be nice." You soon discover that winter breezes are more than just an annoyance when you dwell in a house built of sticks, mud, and hope. Medieval peasants did not merely combat the cold from the outside, they also engaged in personal attacks. Believe me when I say that they battled it from within their own homes, using just whatever they could jam into the crevices. The walls were cracked, the mud was bent, the thatch was collapsed, and the cold sagged, seems to sneak into new locations every night like a cunning poltergeist with a grudge sealing the house, became into an art form, with peasants using moss to fill in the cracks. Bundles of dry grass, straw fragments, old linen, and occasionally even animal fur if it was wedged into a hole and felt soft, spongy, or somewhat insulating. Some more tenacious individuals spread additional mud and manure layers over the exterior of their walls as a yearly winter undertaking. Picture yourself standing there in slapping cold manure onto your own home in freezing weather and murmuring, "This is okay. This is luxury," since, in a sense, roof leaks constituted still another battleground. Despite being inexpensive and widely available, thatch wasn't particularly waterproof, especially during a few rainy and snowy seasons. Peasants would use extra textile scraps, bundles of books, or in times of extreme despair, pieces of turf are taken from the closest field. Each. At some point, house began to resemble a somewhat depressing patchwork quilt created by someone who gave up in the middle. If you had windows or doors, you were fortunate, but even so, they were little. In addition to iron nails holding wood boards, window apertures were frequently wrapped with thick fabric saturated in animal fat or animal hides to keep out the harshest drafts and provide an added scent of bringing mystery meat into the living room. Each night was a conflict between human resourcefulness and the unrelenting. You might be toasty one minute, and then a quick gust of wind would find you missed it. Yet somehow it slapped you awake like a cold hand of doom. By cunning, obstinacy, and an unwillingness to accept a little bit of frozen, persistent condition of being medieval peasants who endured the harshest winters, befuddled, packed, and patched. When the cold hits, nature can present them with one dirty fistful at a time. The medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even bother to act like it's not difficult enough to keep you up at night. Instead of everyone napping at once, they came up with a survival plan that today would be proud of any military leader to sleep throughout shifts. It wasn't some well-planned system with roll calls and whistles, was far more basic and needy. While half of the family stayed up to tend to the fire and fix any stray drafts, the other half huddled under, attempting to get a few hours of half-frozen slumber with threadbare blankets and hay. The fire required continuous. If attention was ignored, it would wane, and remembering to renew it was roughly as someone had to be on ember patrol, since it was as simple as persuading an obstinate donkey to dance, and nobody wanted to get up. Families switched shifts after they were at last comfortable, and you fell asleep for a few hours. Lurched over to the hearth after being elbowed awake, trying not to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no late-night snacks or night vision goggles. Definitely not 5 more minutes of snooze buttons, just heavy eyes and stiff joints. Having a mounting grudge against the person who slept the loudest during your shift, kids old enough to wield a stick, were early on in the service learning process. Everyone did their share of the work over the winter. Or stopped trying. Grandparents occasionally lingered by the fire for longer because of their experience. And, to be honest, because having arthritis made it really difficult to lie down and get back up, especially when it was good luck with people moving around, animals rustling, and wind when it's your turn to sleep pounding on the walls and the sporadic poke from a sibling who unintentionally rolled over too forcefully. It was a wonder to obtain good sleep. yet the system functioned in spite of the fatigue. There was always a pair of eyes and icy, reluctant hands available to keep the hearth burning when people slept in shifts. Next time you complain, remember that the family survived because the embers did. Consider the medieval peasant straining into a window while you're considering getting up to change the thermostat or let the cat out. Considering that it's cold when you have to smoke at 3 a.m, I questioned whether toes were really that important. Consider how you must breathe to survive. Medieval peasants used more than just cloaks to fight the frigid air. Fires and inventive sleeping configurations. They even modified their breathing patterns to endure the night. The issue was straightforward. Chilly air was drawn directly into the mouth by deep, open breathing. In a world where pneumonia might kill you before you could say, "Hail Mary," which was a danger that no one wanted to take, peasants acquired the skill of what is often referred to as survival breathing in order to. Instead of taking deep breaths as if they had just finished a marathon, they breathed slowly and shallowly. Most significantly, the goal was to gradually warm the nose, air entering their lungs a little before it did so. It wasn't flawless, but it was better than unintentionally taking a large gulp of frigid air and choking yourself to death by February. Congratulations, you've just purchased a ticket for a week of tearing apart parts of your soul without the assistance of any medical professionals in sight, and Grandma is giving you strong prayers and hot onion tea. People even made a makeshift breath as they slept by tucking pieces of their shawls, rags, or cloaks up over their faces. Warmer barrier, which naturally resulted in a patch of damp, slightly soggy fabric sticking to your mouth by children, were taught these skills early in the morning, but it was still better than freezing from the inside out. During the chilly months, parents would reprimand children for panting like dogs indoors. And to be honest, between strict medieval childhood winters were marked by breathing exercises, uncomfortable wool clothing, and sharing a bed with a hostile, gassy goat. At night, snuggled under straw bedding, character development takes on a whole new level. Breathing became an art form next to a softly steaming cow and heaps of cloaks. Construct a nose that is constant and gradual and as little as possible, like some gloomy medieval yoga vacation, but with more frostbite and less. Though it wasn't the most eye-catching tactic, the grand survival playbook's encouraging sayings, peasants toiled through another night in the fields, one short breath at a time. In the never-ending struggle against the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, peasants found in one of the finest ways to use an unusual secret weapon is to have a full stomach. Stuffing yourself with something substantial and heavy was a better way to combat the cold than wearing another itchy wool cloak. The more calories your body needed to process before bed, the warmer it would be. As it worked, it heated up more. This is how fundamental medieval thermodynamics works. Heavy meals produce heat internally and may even help you live until morning. Before a long time, what did medieval peasants heap upon their plates without becoming a peasant-shaped popsicle? Consider making hearty stews with a lot of root vegetables, such as turnips and onions, on chilly nights. Additionally, the parsnip grains, oat porridge, barley garl, or thick chewy, were lifesavers. If you were particularly fortunate, such as following a celebration day or a generous, this wasn't comforting. You might even get a piece of dried sausage or a chunk of salty pork thrown into the stew. Instagram cuisine lacks artistic garnishes and a sophisticated presentation. It was a single, massive, hazily brown meal meant to burn slowly through your stomach like a friendly brick. The evening and keeping you slightly warmer. It wasn't only about consuming much of it concerned, consuming intelligent foods that were slower to digest and offered a gradual fatty foods were especially commended for their constant drip of warmth, not only for the energy they offered, but a gut full of fat burned more slowly than lean meat. Peak medieval winter luxury consisted of stew bread and a dubious quantity of lard. Even the pickiest kids were fed well by their parents, so it didn't matter if Tiny Thomas didn't enjoy turnips. Consumed the bitter but useful turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed them. Naturally, medieval parenting involved a lot of eating at night. Carried risks of its own. Although you might be warmer, you were also running the chance of having a night filled with vivid, strange nightmares that were driven by a was it worth it to strive frantically to digest a field's worth of cabbages? Definitely, since peasants' ultimate goal was to survive rather than to eat a Michelin-starred meal, and if that entailed sleeping with a swollen body and breathing through your nose while near a steaming cow, well, that was only another night in the continuous pursuit of another icy dawn, long before fancy heated blankets and electric blankets, mattress pads. If medieval peasants desired a bit more warmth at home, they had to get inventive. Bedtime, making the ever-glamorous hot stone and the unassuming haybox the unsung heroes of winter. Heroes, let's begin by discussing the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it was. However, the brilliant idea was for peasants to line it with a solid wooden box, firmly with hay, and use it to keep previously prepared meals warm for hours. Remaining stew. Put the hot porridge in the hay box and cover it. It will keep hot enough for a late-night snack without requiring medieval slow cookers essentially. But peasants didn't take the chance of rekindling the fire. Simply stop at food. They discovered that hay could trap heat from something else if it could do the same for a stew pot. Before going to bed, even greater rocks enter the hot stone era. Someone would most likely pick up a flat stone and throw it into the heart of the unfortunate child who lost the family dispute. Of the fireplace after roasting it until it was almost too hot to touch the delicate boundary between third party and helpful. With the stone still radiating, they would use a stick or some old tongs to fish it out. Joyful warmth would be gently wrapped in rags and stuffed into a clay pot, or nestled inside an old piece of linen, concealed a medieval heating pad at the foot of the bed or beneath the hay in the mattress, prepared to fight. Naturally, there were dangers if you didn't correctly wrap the stone, but congrats. You now have a small, confined house fire. And let's just say that if you dropped it on your foot, claim that slipping on ice wasn't usually the source of winter injuries, but when everything went according to plan, that stone offered hours of priceless, reassuring warmth. It wasn't opulent, but when you lived luxury in a half-frozen cabin, was not having icicles hanging over your head when you woke up, a heated rock from your nose amid the vast arsenal of medieval winter survival. Although it may not sound glamorous, snuggling into some hay was a necessity for peasants who were desperate for any heat they could find. Little miracle. The hearth wasn't only used for cooking dinner in a medieval peasant's house. It was essentially a family member, albeit a smoky, temperamental, and occasionally uncooperative one, still vital for existence, particularly when it came to sleeping. Your chances of waking up unfrozen increased with proximity to the fire. Therefore, sleeping arrangements were less about individual taste and more about placing babies in strategic prime. Real estate parents gave preference to the elderly and those who were ill or fragile. Stronger adults and older children spread out from there like layers of human insulation, each being given a location near babies were delicate. And the fire wasn't just an act of goodwill. It was fundamental survival math. Elders and heat generators were invaluable sources of family wisdom and, let's face it, the finest rumors. It wasn't negotiable to keep them warm, yet roasting by the fire too near wasn't comfortable. You ran the chance of waking up with your cloak burning suspiciously too far, or your hair singed, and you were. It was a careful dance to be close enough to bask, essentially camping in an icebox, in the glow of the fire, but not close enough that you had to tell your neighbor that you now appeared half-cooked. Additionally, the fire primarily burned the victims, rather than distributing warmth evenly. Right in front of it, while everyone else squabbled like icy lizards for a place in the limited cone of heat. If you were fortunate enough to sleep with your back to the fire, you might have one side that is deliciously warm and one side that isn't. Pets and animals, of course, are muscled in too, and a dog might wedge itself because it's frozen so solid you could probably bang on it. Between you and the flaming chickens that are wagging dangerously close to you, occasionally clucking quietly into the night, while perilously perched on hearthstones, resembling little feathery protectors of every shift of burning embers, every crackle of the logs, and every warmth was a small assure me that you are still alive and that you are currently warm. So peasants drifted. The pops and hisses of the fire lulled them into restless sleep as each breath formed. Beyond the brittle circle of the fire, little clouds in the cold air weren't. Although it wasn't cozy, it was ideal. Life was barely hanging on to warmth. In the medieval era, no one survived the winter by themselves unless they so desired thanks to blazing coals. By January, survival had evolved into more than simply a family to become a highly fashionable frozen statue. Arrangement, it was a noisy, dirty local project where the peasants understood that everyone's life and comfort depended on one another. In a mound of hay and a powerful fire, in the depth of winter, could only accomplish so much if you observed that the smoke from old Tom's hearth had abruptly stopped curling into the darkness at your neighbor's house. But it wasn't just because Tom owed you a chicken that someone went to inspect the sky. That could be a contributing factor. However, because of the need for collective survival, settlements experienced an unofficial winter. Watchers are, frequently, young or elderly people who are unable to labor in the fields but can monitor who is coughing excessively, whose house appeared a bit too motionless in the morning frost, or who hadn't visited the market to trade in a few days. With a lot more sheep and no fluorescent vests, these individuals were the medieval equivalent of neighborhood patrol. In the event that a family's fire went out, a nice neighbor would bring a blazing coal wrapped in rags and dash over, or even better, invite them inside. Yes, that meant cramming an extra room into their own smoke-filled, crammed hut for the night. It was preferable to finding frozen pals come spring thaw, even though there were 4 bodies in an already small area. Food reserves also played a part. During particularly harsh winters, towns occasionally withdrew their last salted meat. Grain and dried vegetables were the only things everyone had, but it was a terrible charity. The difference between stumbling into spring or not could be determined by community meals. Even kids were aware of the risks. They assisted in delivering wood, sharing embers, and sent urgent signals to anybody in need of assistance. Nobody was too little or exhausted. Medieval communities weren't all sunshine and hugs when winter arrived. Arguments broke out. Disagreements over who borrowed whose nice cooking ware never truly went, or about land goats away. But as the evenings turned icy, old grievances were frequently silently shelved, since it was still worthwhile to save the arrival, because it might, when you needed help in the bitter cold of winter, the entire community turned into one large, uncooperative family, occasionally dysfunctional, frequently humorous, and always aggressively survival-minded. One frozen smile, one crackling fire, and one muddy boot at a time. medieval peasants did more than simply stoke the fire or layer on cloaks when they confronted the harsh winter cold. When the wind outside your paper howled like wolves, they prayed a lot. You wanted every advantage conceivable, including a little divine intervention. But the fire dwindled to gloomy embers, and the walls were thin. Back then, intervention faith was ingrained in every freezer meal and wasn't only a Sunday event. Families would inhale before scuttling beneath layers of straw and scratchy wool. Kneel together, saying quick prayers to protect the ceiling from burning, and their toes connected by the mourning saints evolved into more than just far-off religious leaders. They were the front-line defenders of winter. For example, asked to guard against throat conditions, which are serious issues because a single swallow of cold air might land you, coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas was more than simply the immortal, cheerful gift-giver. Additionally, he was urged to save homes from unexpected destruction during the lean, fatal months when superstitions were rampant. Some families sprinkled a small amount of holy water close to the hearth before daily survival, asleep in the hopes that it might ward off evil spirits, or at the very least after other feast days, others used blessed chalk to mark entrances with begging, mischievous drafts. Candles performed a vital function in providing warmth and good fortune. Vigil candles were occasionally kept burning after being blessed by the village priest or the most devout elderly woman. A fading appeal against the icy darkness tearing at the walls and, of course, the absence of true winter persisted throughout the night. No promises were made during the prayer session, dear Lord. If you just get, I promise to treat my neighbor with more kindness tonight, even if they continue to take our turnips' faith, was a daily urgent conversation that the peasants weren't inquiring about, not some abstract solace. Just surviving with a little food, some heat, and another day to muddle is luxury. It was just pure hope whispered into the smoke, till spring shattered the icy hold on their small settlements. Rafters nestled beneath prickly sheets and entangled in panting prayers that miraculously sustained them despite all of their resourcefulness, prayers, and determination over the endlessly harsh winter nights. The truth that medieval peasants threw at winter was sometimes insufficient, and when winter prevailed, it didn't take a few unfortunate people. Entire families and entire communities vanished, them into quiet under a thick layer of snow and ice. Some winters were especially harsh, such as the notorious rains devastated crops during the Great Famine in 1315, causing livestock to suffer, and an already harsh existence became a slow-moving, grinding catastrophe due to the frigid temps. People were so in need that rumors circulated about their consuming shoe leather bark, and in the worst situations, each failure to maintain the fire wasn't merely a bother. It was, frequently, a death sentence. Family huddled without the hearth's scant warmth. Neighbors would occasionally discover entire households in spring bodies still locked together for the last time, in each other's icy grasp, as though attempting to exchange a bit more warmth till the end. In the event of severe snowfall or ice storms, end houses themselves may collapse, with the roof giving way. During a frigid night, it wasn't only disastrous, but frequently, it was also not a guarantee that you would die pushing yourself through thigh-deep snow to seek refuge from neighbors. Disease enjoyed the cold and malnutrition, especially if those neighbors were already overburdened. Compromised the body and crowded, smoke-filled dwellings became havens for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other fatal diseases. A December cough might quickly turn into a funeral by January, followed by the silent horror of frostbite on fingers, toes, and even blackened ears, died with their owners still connected. A dismal badge of honor that read, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me," was worn by some people who endured winters at the expense of their limbs. However, the strange normalcy of the death is far more frightening than the actual death itself. In spite of the extreme cold and constant threat, medieval peasants persisted in their stubborn grief and clinging to life because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But hidden beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a tradition of unwavering perseverance and unadulterated, defiant inventiveness. They didn't have comfortable memory, foam beds, or central heating warm jackets, and they didn't even have the luxury of presuming they would live till spring, but they did have and left behind a resilience blueprint. Every hand-banked fire, every hasted mattress, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure faced with impossible odds. They didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They were prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did, because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm. Future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward. Enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights, all of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them, the nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One stubborn heartbeat, one breath, one ember at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet, born around 1501 likely at Blickling Hall or He Castle. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble woman with powerful family ties in the grand scheme of Tudor society. Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple yet. From these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root, a life that would one day tilt the course of English history. From an early age, Anne was set apart, not by her wealth, but by her mind. She was clever-spirited, and by all accounts, magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent where her education truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands, an experience few English girls could dream of. There Anne absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit. while other young women perfected their embroidery. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne had mastered conversational intrigue and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. She was a unique woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. Although her admirers acknowledged that she wasn't a classic beauty, she had striking dark eyes that glowed with intelligence, a quick musical voice, and a manner of moving that suggested purpose that was barely hidden beneath layers of courtly grace. At a time when a woman's destiny was frequently determined by her birth and marriage, Anne did more than simply enter rooms. She altered their gravity. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen in a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses. Anne refused to quietly fade into obscurity because she had witnessed the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. It was impossible to overlook Anne's dark hair and her lightning-fast and unpredictable nature. At first, she played the part expected of her as Queen Catherine of Aragon's maid of honor, but even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to extinguish. She danced gracefully, spoke French with ease, and laughed with a confidence that few women dared display. The court buzzed quietly about the attractive Boleyn girl, and soon after, she attracted the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Her bold eyes and quick, sharp wit distinguished her from the gentle, submissive ladies who filled King Henry VIII's court. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaison. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. She teased, she challenged, she refused Henry. A man used to instant adoration was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court. Anne astonishingly said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married. His Queen Catherine was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candle-lit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted, he was obsessed. And in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag. Namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful. The Queen's divorce was not only scandalous, it was nearly unimaginable, but Henry was adamant. He convinced himself and attempted to persuade everyone else that his marriage to Catherine was doomed. because she had previously wed his brother Arthur, despite the Pope having granted special permission for their union years earlier. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear overly eager and kept herself just out of reach, alternately boosting Henry's hopes and keeping her distance. Every look and word was measured. She wasn't just aiming for marriage. She was setting herself up to become Queen of England. With the winds of power shifting, the court burst into factions and murmurs. While some noble families enthusiastically courted Anne's favor, others clung tenaciously to Queen Catherine, who was appalled at the prospect of Anne taking the place of her ambassadors and sent frantic letters back to Rome. As months stretched into years, Henry's own advisors shifted nervously, feeling the ground tremble beneath their feet as foreign rulers promised reprisal. As Henry's anger mounted, he inundated the Pope with petitions, used his lawyers to find legal openings, and gradually came to understand that the Church would not budge. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on defying advice tradition, and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart. She was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back after nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering scandal and diplomatic chaos. Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off in January 1533. She secretly married Henry VIII. A bold move, given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe by June. Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse. Anne came into her queenship as a storm, rather than an adored figure, in contrast to Catherine, who personified the traditional English virtues of piety and humility. Anne was a brilliant, politically astute, and provocative woman who dressed vivid colors, led the court with keen insight, and quickly made formidable adversaries. Even though her position appeared secure, it was actually extremely precarious because everything depended on one thing: giving Henry a male heir. Anne was well aware that she was more than just Henry's lover. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were thrilled that the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth. To her credit, Anne composed herself while insisting that the next child would undoubtedly be a son. His eyes, which had once been filled with adoration, now flickered with doubt, but for a while, Anne's star blazed brightly. She transformed the English court in her image, bringing her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil typically reserved for kings. Her influence was so great that foreign ambassadors vying for her favor, couriers, and alliances were rearranged to court her favor. To ensure that Anne's crown could not be questioned, the once obedient Henry started to move England formally away from Rome and establish the Church of England with himself at its head. However, even in her victory, dark clouds gathered friends who whispered behind their hands, rivals circled waiting, and Henry, who was already restless and erratic, was starting to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but maintaining it would require more than charm, ambition, or even love. Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time, but the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry V had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away his disappointment, carving rifts between them. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness. Her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in outside the royal chambers. Enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's followers never forgiven Anne for what they perceived to be theft and sacrilege. Even commoners teased her, dubbing her the Great, and blamed her for the break with Rome and the subsequent oppressive reforms. Then Jane Seymour arrived, modest and demure, and everything Anne wasn't. When Anne's influence started to wane, where she had once dazzled Henry with her brilliance and challenge, Jane offered him consoling compliance. It was a risky change, and Anne, as perceptive as ever, saw it coming. She attempted to regain her position by lavishing Henry with attention, promising more sons, and pleading for patience. But the king, who was always erratic, had already started to imagine life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies included Thomas Cromwell. Her ally started setting the stage for a destructive campaign as soon as they realized the tide was turning, gathering witnesses, gossip, and allegations in secret. The woman who had so skillfully navigated the perilous game of ambition was now losing ground. Anne had gained her throne via bravery and guile, but in the cruel, ever-changing world of Henry's court, past triumphs meant little. Only new success mattered, and Anne's adversaries were honing their weapons. The queen who had destroyed a kingdom would soon realize how easily a kingdom could destroy her. Instead of attacking her with armies or swords, Boleyn's foes came with whispers, secrets, and highly honed lies in the courtroom backrooms where treachery was simmering, patiently and fatally. After their relationship was founded on shared ambition, Thomas Cromwell, Anne's biggest supporter during the English Reformation, turned against her. Anne wanted measures to aid the impoverished and curtail the authority of avaricious aristocrats. Cromwell desired stability, favor with Henry, and no meddling. Anne's audacity had made her dangerous, and in Henry's erratic heart, love had turned to annoyance, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had few true friends left, and even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's desire for a softer, more accommodating queen, and Jane Seymour, quiet and cunning, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's waning fire. Cromwell took the initiative, knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted to leave, but had no easy reason. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would degrade Henry, but by disgrace? The charges were outrageous and heinous, including adultery and incest conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud and brilliant queen, was portrayed as a treacherous woman who was a danger to the very crown she had once redefined. In Henry's court, truth was whatever the king required it to be. Cromwell meticulously gathered evidence, coerced confessions under torture, and twisted courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges were illogical and full of contradictions and impossibilities. Sensing the tightening noose, Anne fought valiantly, appealing to Henry's memory of their past love, but to no avail. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to look her in the eyes. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where the great gate slammed behind her. Anne realized that she was no longer a queen, but rather a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the cruel game she had once played. Her fate was sealed by her betrayal, and now she was alone in the tower, waiting for the decisive move. In a different world, such accusations against a queen would have been unimaginable, but in this one, they were merely theater, a grim performance intended to give Henry VII exactly what he wanted. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. They sat in judgment, cold and watchful, ready to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. High treason conspiracy against the king and shocking adultery with several men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were among the charges against her. Anne's downfall was shrouded in a thin veil of legality. She defended herself with the same fervor that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence precision and an unwavering composure that even her enemies were astounded by. She reminded them that she had been crowned with God-selected sacred oil and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, sacrifices, and love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been rendered long before Anne entered the courtroom, and the trial was a public spectacle that saw a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words, dates, and places, contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant. Now Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering when the verdict was read and did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact in those final moments. Before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had been brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death, yet even facing the end. Anne refused to crumble in the cold, echoing halls of the tower. Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes, because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter Elizabeth, her ladies in waiting. Those few who had stayed loyal wept in private. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head in her dark humor. Was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable Henry VIII. Meanwhile showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was arranging his next marriage for Anne. This final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut on May 18th, 1536. Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. In an act of royal benevolence, Henry had arranged for a French swordsman to do the death more quickly, cleanly, and brutally than an axe. This minor favor was possibly purchased more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort at morning. Pining up her dark hair and tucking it under a simple cap, Anne prepared for her last moment in a dark gray gown of damask trimmed with fur and a crimson kirt beneath colors of dignity and sacrifice. As the tower's chilly morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, she was prepared to face the blade with grace. When Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, survivor fighter, walked forward, there would be no more tears, just one last act of bravery in the face of history's condemnation. Her journey was just getting started, but her demise was imminent. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold inside the Tower of London's walls. Courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, and a small throng gathered in stillness, as though even the stone walls were holding their breath. Anne stood upright, her gray robe billowing slightly in the chilly morning breeze. She appeared thinner than she had at court, her face calm but pale. Were no weeping or hysteria. If anything, she confronted death in the same way. She spoke carefully and briefly, with a steely dignity that had once brought a kingdom to its knees. In her parting remarks, she refrained from making accusations and defending herself, prayed for the king, the man who had deserted her in those last hours, to be healthy and prosperous. Anne's bravery astounded everyone by offering the world forgiveness rather than a confession. The people the French executioner had brought specifically to guarantee a speedy death rushed forward to witness her fall. With her hands folded in prayer and her gaze raised toward the heavens, she stayed motionless while a tiny piece of white fabric was put across her eyes. Once silent, the blade flashed quickly, and Anne Boleyn, the Queen Mother and history creator, wasn't. Additionally, she was promptly laid to rest in an arrow box in an unmarked burial inside the castle grounds because a queen once crowned in gold had no fitting coffin ready for her. Let to disappear without a funeral, yet Anne's tale did not end there because her daughter, Elizabeth, survived. One of the greatest kings in English history would be the child whose birth had once let a king down. History of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign would witness the emergence of English artistic dominance and worldwide impact through a queen who inherited her Anne Boleyn, transformed the world with her mother's fiery personality, brilliant intelligence, and unwavering resilience. Her aspirations contributed to the rupture with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, changing the history of England forever. Fall shone to the world that even queens may be disregarded, yet Elizabeth Anne's legacy endures via her blood. Shined more brilliantly than any crown she had ever worn in her life, and Anne Boleyn ultimately prevailed. A sort of immortality, not because she lived, but because of her lasting influence on the American colonies were simmering like a pot by the early 1770s. The once proud mother country's relationship with Britain had eroded over a long period of time. 2 years earlier had not been the beginning of the animosity, suspicion, and rising rage. The Stamp Act, which imposed tariffs on everything from playing cards to newspapers, had infuriated colonists. The Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on necessities like paint, paper, and glass, came next. Every new rule enacted by a parliament hundreds of miles distant, where colonists were not represented, was similar to anger initially manifested itself when another spark fell into dry bush. Colonial assemblies created formal petitions and vehement pamphlets. Boycotts were established by merchants to protest, and authors like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson argued fervently for liberty and liberties in 1776 newspapers. But as time went on, frustration gradually came to the realization that Britain wasn't paying attention, and even worse, that Britain didn't give a damn. The colonists held on to the belief that if they made enough noise and used enough logic, Parliament would abolish taxes, and occasionally they did. For example, the Stamp Act was infamously repealed. After clamorous colonial protests, yet each minor triumph was followed by new laws, new taxes, and insults. But the money wasn't the main focus. By British standards, the taxes themselves were always rather low. The idea that the colonists were being taxed without their consent and treated more like subjects than Boston's residents ruled more like remote property than collaborators. Any other city turned into the center of the Sons of Liberty's rebellion. Tensions in 1770 saw a covert, ferocious core of patriots become more vocal and audacious, erupted into violence during the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers opened fire on defenseless residents. Blood had already discolored the cobblestones, and by 1773, the colonies were in danger of collapsing. They were on the verge of open defiance after a final insult, but it did not in the guise of troops, new regulations, or armies, but in the silent, seemingly innocuous form of containers filled with. Although the colonists were unaware of it at the time, tea floated in the cold that night. The world will forever change in 1773 when Parliament made a crucial decision about the waters of Boston Harbor. They made a mistake and approved the Tea Act, a statute that assumed the American colonies would absorb cheaper tea in silence. Was intended to reaffirm Britain's claim over the ailing British East India Company, and incidentally, on paper, taxing the colonies seemed like a good idea, and the Tea Act permitted the enterprise to cut out the middlemen and sell tea directly to the colonies, lowering prices and providing a luxury product at a discount, a few pennies less expensive. But what could go wrong? All because the Tea Act's underlying principle, rather than the tea's price, was the issue, leaving the dreaded tax on tea firmly established. Accepting the tea, even at a reduced price, would entail recognizing Parliament's authority to impose taxes. The colonies without many Americans' approval, which was unimaginable. Release of the freedoms they had battled to defend for over 10 years. The Tea Act's news spread, like all across the colonies. Merchants were incensed because they perceived a monopoly as a threat to their livelihoods. Smash local trade nationalists furiously at the secret message that the monarchy continued to accept. It was free to do as it pleased in Boston, where the response was particularly harsh, and the city was already damaged by the following the Boston Massacre and years of financial suffering. Bostonians realized that the Tea Act was a ruse. Refusing the tea turned into a test of honor and a contract. Devotion to the cause of liberty, public gatherings, newspaper columns, and fiery rhetorical organizations such as Samuel Adams's Sons of Liberty and others were boycotts promising not to dump or sell any tea from the East India Company consumed on American territory across the colonies. Ships transporting the contentious tea were rejected by local opposition in ports ranging from Charleston to New York. The message was unambiguous. We will not be purchased, but destiny took a different turn in Boston. 3 vessels, the Beaver, Ellenina, and Dartmouth, arrived anchored in the harbor, refusing to depart, and royal officials demanded that the tea be. The colonists refused to unload, resulting in a standstill that developed into a drawn bowering. A single act would end the unconscionable tension, and history would never be the same once more, with the British tea ship obstinately moored in Boston. Harbor, the city itself became an explosive keg with each day that went by without resolution increased the strain because Boston wasn't merely opposing, it was getting ready. Anger-filled colonists argued for a fight in bars, churches, and public squares. How should the Sons of Liberty, led by ferocious individuals like Samuel Adams John, proceed? Paul Revere and Hancock organized resistance quickly, posting on social media, advertisements urging people to boycott British tea, and hosted raucous gatherings that attracted farmers, craftspeople, and every meeting of merchants fueled the old South meetings' flames. With thousands of people packed into the wooden hall and their breath obscuring the air, the house turned into the resistance's nerve center. Resolutions were passed, despite their voices being raised in protest. Every vote against the unloading of tea was a further blow to the British, and speeches were exchanged, and tempers ran high. Authority, but time was running out while Bostonians stood together. British legislation required the unloading and payment of taxes on imported products such as tea. After 20 days, if the ships were still there beyond the customs inspector's deadline, the Sons of Liberty understood that the shipment would be seized and that the levy would be recovered by force, that the principal would be lost once the tax was paid, even if it was protested, was more about whether the colonies would tolerate being treated as subjects without rights than it was about the tea anymore, or if they would take a stand and defend their future. In the meanwhile, the royal governor of Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts dug in his heels and wouldn't allow the tea ships to go without unloading their goods, insisting that the law be followed. Damn him to colonial indignation. Resigning means acknowledging that the colonies of Boston were governed by mobs rather than kings. Every man, woman, and kid saw the standoff turn into a spectacle and sensed that something was about to happen. When the globe takes its breath, it would just take a cold, acute sense before a storm. Was all it took for an explosion to start, and somewhere in the congested streets and hearts of Boston was discreetly formulating a scheme that would reverberate across oceans. And on December 16th, 1773, the daybreak over Boston was bleak and chilly. For almost 3 weeks, the city hovered on the brink of history, with the tea ships sitting in the final date had arrived, and the harbor was like ticking time bombs. According to British law, if it wasn't customs, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of the ship's arrival. Everyone was aware that authorities may confiscate the goods and dispatch British troops to uphold the law. Everyone was aware that the concept would be lost if the tea came ashore. The colonists' claim to liberty and liberties would be undermined that morning if they permitted it, even after their cause. The Old South Meeting House, the biggest structure in Boston, was crowded with thousands of Bostonians and neighboring colonies. To attend the conference, some people traveled miles across the freezing countryside, was crammed with people that men poured out into the streets to listen to the blazing speeches from Samuel Adams. The iron voice of revolt reverberated down the corridors, oversaw the event, and each speaker stood up to condemn the Tea Act and voice their opposition to tyranny, to demand quick action. But uncertainty persisted despite the defiance. However, how could they do it without starting a full-scale conflict? As the afternoon drew on, riders galloped to halt the tea without unleashing a torrent of vicious reprisal. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was unaffected by the sobering news that the ships would not be permitted to go without. The tax collected under King's law would be confiscated when the tea was unloaded. Suddenly, the meeting house's walls appeared to tremble under the force of the enraged mob. But Samuel Adams said the final words to terminate the debate while remaining composed. Everyone understood the meaning of the simple sentence, "Yet this assembly can do nothing more to save the nation." No more petitions, no more concessions, and no action would be captured outside a battle yell that sliced through the growing darkness as the signal men swiftly covered their faces with soot, draping blankets and feathers in a rudimentary Mohawk impersonation. Warriors, the goal was to create a sign and a statement that no one could misunderstand. Boston would respond without using words if it were thought that the deadline had passed. With resistance as Boston's twilight became darker on December 16th. In 1773, individuals emerged from the shadows as the peaceful streets started to stir. Ordinary folks wearing scratchy blankets, some with feathers on their faces, some with soot-blackened faces. They used a symbolic disguise in an attempt to trick people into thinking they were actual Mohawks. Act of letting go of their previous identities and standing as something new and forceful by the hundreds they created traveling to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea vessels, the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and Eleanor, were anchored. There was no shouting, and the port water churned dark and chilly beneath them, heavy with the winter air's keen bite. Drunken mayhem. This was a mission executed with composure and brutality, not a riot. The colonists in disguise, equipped with clubs and hatchets, rushed the ships, overtaking the few remaining crewmen. The sailors were unharmed. As the operation started, they were shoved aside and silently observed as the guys divided. Others used skillful blows to open the wooden boxes, releasing the aroma of freshly brewed tea into the chilly night air, hauled the boxes overboard, leaving behind thunderous splashes that reverberated around the harbor's calm waters. Chest after chest, 342, in thousands of pounds of tea leaves flowed in the dark water after the total was broken and discarded. British guards positioned nearby created noise while onlookers silently observed from the battlefield. There is still no action to stop the violence, whether out of sympathy or confusion. It's uncertain, but some reports indicate that even British loyalists understood something had changed, and tonight there would be no halting it because of the tremendous discipline. Only the tea, the despised emblem, was taken from the ships. No one else raided them for goods. Of British oppression was targeted in a place where the men had to deal with starvation and misery on a daily basis. Could have easily used the demonstration as a pretext to steal, but they refrained. Looked like a massive whirling cauldron full of ripped cloth as it was above the harbor. The scent of the sea combined with the bitter tang of broken tea fills the night air with a mixture of chests and soaking tea leaves. The work was completed quietly, and the guys vanished into a weird, bitter-sweet fragrance. The night disappearing into Boston's back streets and alleyways, leaving no leaders, no names, and no claims to fame in their wake. As the final shattered containers bobbed in the air, just the obvious sign of revolution. The Boston Tea Party stood motionless in the murky sea, nearly holding its breath. Wasn't a brawl, riot, or drunken spectacle. Rather, it was something much more uncommon, and under the cover of darkness, an act of cold, willful defiance turned the port into a gigantic, swirling large mats of teapots containing thousands of pounds of East India Company tea drifted on the some inquisitive and disobedient colonists scooped handfuls of the black-stained water. of damp leaves from the bay, only to be reprimanded by the Sons of Liberty who were on guard around the docks. Saved, nobody would benefit from the effort done this evening. This was a pure principle, and simply put, news spread like wildfire when the town woke up the following morning to the lingering scent of salty tea. By noon, everyone, from merchants to apprentices, had huge sheets of mouth letters, realized what had occurred, and patriots' views quickly diverged pride. A ferocious, swollen pride that common men had confronted the largest empire in the globe and delivered a blow to liberty among moderates and loyalists. They were horrified by the careless property destruction. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was furious because the colonies had gone too far and couldn't turn back. His mansion was incensed at the message it conveyed as well as the damage. Where else would revolt occur if the king's authority could be so flagrantly disregarded in Boston? British officials were taken aback by the spark. Perhaps they had anticipated demonstrations and boycotts. They didn't anticipate another coordinated, disciplined riot, like to those that had erupted over the Stamp Act. Tens of thousands of pounds of royal goods were peacefully destroyed by revolutionaries without even smashing a window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Elena, and Beaver ships were powerless to stop the disappearance of their cargo. The official ledgers would show that the night's loss was more than 10,000 pounds. British pounds was a fortune, but the actual loss was either ruined or not quantified in pounds sterling. Tea was based on devotion and confidence in the flimsy delusion that Britain, the night the tea sunk somewhere, she continued to control her colonies with acquiescence. A common, indisputable truth emerged from deeper. The era of tranquil reckoning was imminent. The protest was drawing to a close, and Boston was prepared. When the Boston Tea Party arrived in London after crossing the Atlantic, the British responded quickly and angrily. Officials said it was more than just a protest. It was an open challenge to revolt. To unavoidable royal power, King George III, after learning it was reported that the news had become icy with rage, and the Parliament was already annoyed by outrage over years of colonial disobedience erupted, and they sought punishment rather than only for Boston, but as a warning to all American colonies. The outcome was a set of extremely strict restrictions. The first blow fast came, and they were soon dubbed the unforgivable actions in America. In a cruel move, Parliament mandated the closure of Boston Port Act. Boston's busy port served as the city's economic backbone until the demolished. After the tea was paid for and the order was restored, ships were unable to enter. Boston used to be lively and raucous, but the trade dried up and the commodities and supplies disappeared, became eerily silent on its docks, but the punishment continued. The colony's right to self-government was taken away by the Massachusetts Government Act. Firmly, the Administration of Justice Act permitted royal officials who were nominated by the king to offenses to be tried in Britain, sending a strong message that British officials were unassailable, and to ensure because the colonies were aware that using force was a possibility, British soldiers were stationed all over Boston, living among the extremely. They were supposed to suppress the populace because it was obvious that revolt would be. The Crown would no longer allow the luxury of crushed liberty. Yet Parliament's hard hand had an unexpected consequence. The news of Boston's suffering infuriated the other colonies rather than intimidating them into surrender, caused great sympathy when its port was closed and its citizens were starving under martial law. Wagon loads of food and supplies from nearby colonies flooded into Boston amid the righteous rage that swept across America. The formerly divided colonies started to come together through secret meetings, messages of encouragement, and promises of togetherness. Together, what had started out as a Massachusetts issue was quickly becoming into an American one in terms of punishment. Instead of making an example of them, as Britain had anticipated, Boston, a rallying call for resistance to the once flickering flames of revolution, now started to burn from colony to colony in isolated areas, and there would be Boston's punishment spread shockwaves well beyond the rocky beaches of Boston, making it difficult to put them out. For years, the outrage in Massachusetts and the other 13 colonies became a much greater threat to Britain's union. The colonies had behaved like estranged relatives, arguing and competing despite their differences in geography, religion, and rivals in commerce. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and the self-governance of Massachusetts made people around the continent believe that if it could happen to Boston, it could occur to anyone in the states of Virginia, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, colonists responded quickly, sending wagons loaded with food. Town meetings were humming with rage as supplies and letters of solidarity were sent to the suffering people of Boston. Newspaper printers put in endless hours to disseminate the word that the battle was no longer just Boston's. It was now everyone's. Thus, in September 1774, an extraordinary event occurred. The first representatives from 12 of the 13 Continental Congresses met for the first time in Philadelphia. To consider a coordinated reaction, colonists like George Washington, Patrick, Henry John, and others convened under one roof. Once only local leaders, Adams and Samuel Adams now stood together as founders of a movement that was expanding daily. Their objective was not yet fully achieved, at least not formally. Most people still hoped for reconciliation and a return to the previous relationship after independence. Mutual respect under the British Crown, but there is more going on behind the courteous arguments and well-crafted petitions. As understanding grew, the colonies realized they could no longer afford to attend the Congress separately. They promised to help one another in the event of additional British aggression, and they committed to a widespread boycott of British goods, made it apparent that any assault on one colony would be interpreted as an assault on all of them. Throughout the continent, common people started utilizing terms that were previously exclusively murmured in pubs and meeting places. Bringing the hammer down on liberty and private unity resistance. Instead of suppressing insurrection as Boston, Britain had hoped, it brought the colonies together. Despite their differences, a group of people were starting to consider joining forces to create something even more threatening. Themselves as Americans, and the winds of revolution, rather than as dispersed regions, weren't only stirring anymore, they were building into a storm, and Britain couldn't stop it in time. Not only were the crates lost when the tea sunk into Boston Harbor, but the American, because of the Boston Tea Party, colonies could continue to be obedient subjects indefinitely. Parliament could never put out the spark that was ignited in the months that followed. What started off as protests, boycotts, and courteous petitions became into outright resistance as fire spread over the colonies. Town militias started shooting at powder-filled storehouses in the open. Under the same roofs in Boston, men who had previously hailed King George III in bars were now discussing revolution. Became an emblem of sacrifice that was beaten but unflappable the more Britain attempted to. The more the colonies slipped through its grasp, the more tightly it held on to each ship that passed the Boston's closed, quiet harbor, served as a somber warning that tyranny had found an equal in American society. Disobedience, when Parliament introduced the Intolerable Acts, intending to use Boston as a model to frighten rather than subduing neighboring colonies, they established a martyr city. Rallying cry from Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists understood that resistance was essential to their future. By spring, it was about survival, identity, and independence rather than tea. In the communities outside of Boston, the tension peaked in 1775. Lexington and defeated British forces dispatched to seize colonial munitions instead discovered armed farmers, regular men prepared to use muskets to protect their rights. The American Revolution's opening shots were fired in a straight line that was traced reminisce about the day when men poured a fortune's worth of tea into the world learned, during the Boston Tea Party, that revolutions don't necessarily be heralded with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it begins softly with a few committed individuals. Standing in the cold and dropping the tea out of defiance rather than fear. The colonists were opposing an empire as well as invasions, even though one thing had become evident that night in Boston Harbor. The American road ahead would be brutally bitter and uncertain. Colonies were something new. They were no longer obedient subjects. They were revolutionaries, dangerous, and only getting started. All prior to the imposing Giza pyramids, before Mesopotamian towns were humming with, before Stonehenge loomed over the sky, Corral was tucked away in the nearly 5,000 years ago. The dry valleys of coastal Peru's Corral rose in hushed majesty, then vanished into almost total forgetfulness, engulfed by sands and forgotten by 4 millennia. The world was unaware of the existence of the Super Valley. At first appearance, the area where Corral previously flourished appears to be an unusual location for civilization to flourish. For the majority of people, the arid, desolate river is little more than a slender silver thread that winds over dust and boulders. Appeared hostile, a place where life had left it, but it was there in the midst of the emptiness. When one of the first big cities in human history emerged, Corral wasn't merely a transient trading post or a scattering of huts. It was a planned city spanning more than 150 acres, full of featured residential areas, plazas, pyramids, and ceremonial areas. Magnitude, goal, and ambition of a sophisticated culture that flourished millennia before the without a wheel. The Corral people were able to build their own pyramids by stacking stones. Without the use of written language or metal instruments, they constructed enormous constructions out of stone and earth with only human intellect, teamwork, and the unadulterated strength of human will. But for thousands of even when tourists stumbled, Corral's presence was kept a secret for years. They thought the odd, weathered mounds strewn over the valley were simply hills or other natural formations. Nobody knew that one of the oldest towns in the world was hidden beneath the sand, sculpted by the desert winds. Until the late 20th century, the world existed before even the civilizations that history books had declared to be the first. Century in which Ruth Shady's team of archaeologists discovered the truth about what they discovered buried in time's dust would change the America's history and have everyone reevaluate their assumptions regarding the origins of civilization. In complete secrecy, Corral had risen, prospered, and collapsed. Currently, its stones are whispering again after millennia of silence about a universe of intricacy and splendor was created by a peaceful, educated people in a region where it seemed impossible to live, and this was just the start of their. At first glance, the Soup Valley appears to be a site where severe winds should make it difficult for life to exist. The sun cruelly beats down on infinite expanses of stone and sand. Water is limited, the river is meandering, and the earth is drying out, turning the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. To the untrained eye, it appears to be a desolate wasteland where a thread is struggling for survival. The gods had forgotten it, but the people of Corral noticed something odd. they recognized the river, albeit it was small, and instead of seeing a desert to be dreaded, they saw a canvas to be formed. The foundation of opportunity, therefore, with perseverance, creativity, and sheer tenacity, they achieved their first triumph by transforming this harsh environment into a flourishing haven of life and culture. Was agriculture. They served as hubs for governance, worship, and celebration. This was a civilization that decided to negotiate rather than destroy trade, to assemble rather than conquer. Cotton cultivated along the lush river banks was the foundation of Carroll's prosperity and was turned into fishing nets. They were exchanged for dried fish, a vital source of coastal towns' goods, Carroll protein and unique products from distant locations, as well as vibrant Pacific shells, unique tropical fruits from far away, as well as priceless stones from the highlands valleys. This extensive commerce network bound the area together. Distant communities into a harmonious network of reciprocal advantages, and in the Middle Corral prospered as a center of culture, commerce, religion, and, in order to preserve social harmony, the city's expansive public areas and subterranean plazas relied heavily on ceremonial life, probably acted as platforms for ceremonies that brought people together around common spiritual ideas. Music permeated these events. The soundscapes produced by drums crafted from deer hides and flutes carved from condor bones reverberated throughout the additionally desert linking people's lives to something higher seemed to depend less on the military. The city's leaders needed to have coordinated their strength and more on civic organization and spiritual power. Large-scale building projects, intricate trading, and cyclical agricultural cycles deals, all while preserving the terrible wounds of conflict in a historic corral, serves as a bright exception to a world that is so frequently characterized by strife. Reminder that civilization can be created by the conquered and does not have to be constructed on their broken backs. At Corral, the stone still appeared to be the silent force of cooperation, creativity, and trust. To reverberate with remnants of a past world that was more than a city of structures and trade, the city was a hive of ceremonial sound, spiritual rhythms, and archaeologists meticulously excavated the corral culture, which was infused with ritual. The parched sands and revealed a wealth of prehistoric instruments, including flutes made from condor bones and small drums stretched with animal hides and pelican whistles made from deer antlers, were not basic toys that were meticulously made and matched to particular sounds in order to transport sound through the city's expansive plazas in a world without written language. Imagine the low throb of drums increasing as music communicated the language of the soul. Like the desert wind's foot trampling on the sunken plazas, flutes sharp at sunset. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms as hundreds gathered beneath the waning light, with priests wearing. In those times when Corral wasn't there, elaborately woven clothing would chant to the gods of the river, the land, and the stars. Simply a city, it was a symphony, and Corral's design itself implies that ceremony grand plazas were more than just open areas. They were the center of life, stages for group rituals that are thoughtfully planned to bring people together. The like ancient amphitheaters, underground circular courts directed sight and sound toward the ceremonies held at their centers, and all of the pyramids towered over them, not as graves, but as human-made sacred mountains that connect the ground to the heavens are used in rituals. Probably signaled the change of seasons, the planting and harvesting cycles, the motions of the stars, and the absence of music. Only amusement, it served as a link between humans and the natural world, between the familiar and the mysteries without cruel gods of war, violent paintings, or sacrifices made at Corral. The heavenly realm, appears to have been peaceful. Even now, as the desert wind rustles across the remains, you can still feel the joy and respect. I could really hear the faint sounds of old music. The lost melodies of a carol was more than just a location for those who discovered beauty, purpose, and connection in the middle of the harsh, unending sands. It was an engineering marvel that was a tribute to the commerce and ritual of music. Without metal tools, human inventiveness in one of the world's most hostile environments, the people of Corral created a city of stone and earth that has virtually survived without the wheel or draft animals. Their accomplishments over the course of 5,000 years were astounding. Enormous pyramids emerged from the desert floor was built using massive stones that were transported across the arid valley rather than tiny, brittle bricks. Workers used reed sacks and clever baskets that were sturdy enough to move rocks, carry bulky weights made from the very plants that flourished along the riverbanks, which they constructed with layers upon layers. Careful stone stacking and debris filling to build constructions that could endure not only time, but the wrath of nature, which they comprehended well, is contained in an area that frequently experiences strong earthquakes, but their plazas and pyramids have mostly withstood intact. How builders employed flexible techniques to master earthquake-resistant building methods include rounded edges, wide foundations, and layered fillings. That made it possible for their monuments to absorb and release seismic energy. This engineering was innovative and not based on textbooks. Water management was another quiet victory derived from a deep understanding of the ground itself. Despite being in a desert, the Corral people created highly advanced irrigation systems, canals and channels that meticulously directed river water to their fields, enabling crops to thrive. Even no water was wasted during dry seasons. Every drop mattered in the Corral's design. Itself demonstrated excellent urban planning, with large buildings lining up with important astronomical sites, indicating a profound comprehension of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas accurate. More than just meeting spots, geometry served as a tool for monitoring the skies, enabling astronomers and priests to forecast seasons that are essential for survival. Even the city's organization mentioned residential zones that are part of a complex culture. The ceremonial centers and administrative spaces were all set up harmoniously, striking a balance. Community life with hallowed areas they constructed, not only temporarily but permanently. As contemporary engineers marvel at Corral's tenacity, generations today reminded that excellence can sometimes be evaluated by more than just technology. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom comes from knowing the Corral's stones are the result of natural processes acting in harmony with the soil rather than against it. Withstand earthquakes, storms, and the passage of time itself, they serve as a silent reminder of 4 ages. The city of Corral was a society that carved their dreams into the desert sands, blossomed amid the desert as a ray of serenity, music, commerce, and architectural skill. Sands, and then it was abandoned with no signs of fire, almost silently. Its demise left no scars from conquering, and its walls were devoid of mass graves and broken monuments depict a cataclysmic catastrophe. But Corral just faded its. Why did they abandon the plazas, its pyramids, its flutes, and its drums to the wandering sands? According to some academics, the question still haunts the mega valley like a ghost. Environmental change. The concluding data points to the possibility that Corral's agriculture was severely damaged by a protracted drought. Trade networks reliant on surplus cotton would have wilted in the fields if the river's life-giving waters had not been present. Food would have upset Corral's meticulous equilibrium. Its severe climate may have ultimately caused it to topple over beyond repair. According to some interpretations, trade routes changed as nearby societies expanded and new power centers appeared along the corral's impact around the shore. And inland may have reduced the commodities they previously provided. Cotton, seafood, and produce were insufficient to maintain their position as a leading metropolis, gradually becoming the lifeblood of others. Speak of internal decay, while trade is drained away. Written sources. We can only speculate about religious turmoil, political conflicts, or just plain weariness following decades of nonetheless. Even harmonious civilizations can break apart when survival becomes a concern. Regardless of the reason, the departure appears to have been gradual. Unexpectedly, families probably moved away one by one in search of more fruitful areas. Children who used to run over corrals' plazas grew up narrating tales of a lost world, stronger rivers, and fresh starts. Stories from the metropolis behind them that would someday become legends in the desert restored what people had constructed, with winds carrying fine sand across temples made of stone. What had once been a bright humming was now buried behind shifting dunes with flutes. For almost 4,000 years, civilization was reduced to a field of silent resting mounds. Corral stayed. While archaeologists wait today, a whisper is concealed beneath the sands. With precise stone turning, the issue remains. How does a city so sophisticated and exquisitely built just disappear? In fact, it's possible that even the most enlightened and tranquil civilizations are but slender strands in the fabric of time. For millennia, Corral lay exposed to the invisible forces of change, buried beneath the quiet sands of the Super Valley travelers, forgotten, never realizing that beneath their feet were the remains of the weird spherical hills that studded the area. For a society that before the Egyptian pyramids, these were simply natural, wind-sculpted mounds. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that the 1990s would see the return of Corral's voice to the globe. Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist, led a group into the Soup Valley because she was curious and felt that these hills may contain mysteries that no one has yet discovered. What they discover would change the course of history. Layer by meticulous layer, the history of human civilization in the Americas sand was swept away, revealing walls of meticulously chiseled stone behind it. Pyramids, buried squares, staircases, and a city much older than anyone could have. The astounding corral was almost 4,600 years old, as proved by hypothetical radiocarbon dating. It was a startling finding to learn that ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt were flourishing at the same time. Archaeological grounds prior to Corral academics' belief that civilization in the vast powers of the Old World eclipsed the development of the Americas. Corral transformed everything by demonstrating that the Americas had produced intricate urban life, colossal architecture, and societal structure separately long before the Incas or Mur rose to power. Ruth Shady and her group discovered more than just debris and stones. They also discovered fishing nets, musical instruments, and the remains of living things. Ancient knot records, fabrics, and even sacrifices offered to the gods each. The artifact described a people who had established a society with tremendous understanding and vision. More than just a scholarly achievement, Creative Carl's rediscovery was a revival. A society that had long lain dormant beneath the desert was suddenly exposed beneath the return to the open sky, its squares embraced by the same winds that formerly transported the today. The sounds of flutes and children's laughing are acknowledged as a delicate and invaluable link to humanity's early history, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thoughts of creating a sense of identity and the conviction that the dunes have effectively concealed Corral. But ultimately, the stones persisted, hoping that someone will pay attention and remember that Cairo stands as a quiet among its pyramids and plazas. The giant serves as a reminder that civilization's origins are much deeper than we previously thought. Our perception of humanity's journey is altered by the old stones whispering of a tale that is not one of conquering and conflict, but also of peace, creativity, and optimism, long before the imposing empires of the inhabitants of Corral were constructing something in Greece, Rome, or perhaps Egypt. Amazingly, they plotted the constellations without written records, built pyramids without a wheel, and prosperous community based on engineering, trade music, and rituals without leaving any traces of, in an era frequently characterized by violence, war on the land. Corral presents an alternative perspective on what a civilization can be: a community that prioritized relationships over knowledge acquisition. Domination serves as a reminder that greatness does not necessarily necessitate violence, is determined by how a society comes together to build rather than by how many troops march across a battlefield. Carroll's legacy extends much beyond the arid shores of the soup. It questions the long-held belief that civilization had a unique cradle, that monumental architecture and urban life were originally found in the Old World. Demonstrates how the inventive and aspirational spirit of humanity emerged independently in different parts of the earth, formed by many hands, yet propelled by the same timeless aspirations to walk amid corrals today and persevere in celebrating and reaching for the divine. You can practically hear the faint buzz of flutes and the pulse of drums amid the worn remains. Children laughing as they race through stone lanes, and traders negotiating in the plazas beneath a sky of "We still bear the inscriptions of many stars, lives, dreams, and stories." Corral shows us that even when civilizations collapse, their spirits can continue to sleep, lying beneath the sands to be recalled and to be inspired once more in the great historical chronology. Corral stands out not only as a remnant of the past, but also as a message for the future, that even in the most hostile deserts, even under, the seeds of curiosity, wisdom, and peace can germinate and grow in the hardest sands. A world that strives for excellence,